this afternoon, I'm going to take you, as I mentioned earlier today, through some of the testimony that I gave the Unclaimed Mineral Proceeds Commission. And then we're going to focus on specific information that gives us a course, that gives us an idea of what course of action we need to take and why. One of the things that's so important is to try and understand why it is that we feel somebody did something wrong. The state did something wrong to us. So, what we're going to do in that regard, I'm going to review some federal information. It has to do with our Constitution. And we're going to touch on what it was that was supposed to have happened when our ancestors were approached with regard to registering their land and with regard to being dispossessed of their land. And we're going to collectively take a look at it and think, okay, did what happened to our ancestors, was it right or was it wrong in accordance with our Constitution? And you're going to draw your own conclusions in a little bit, and I'll give you mine. Keep in mind, I am not an attorney. All I'm doing is giving you a perspective that I would take if I was a federal IG, and at one time I was, looking at Texas with a complaint about how it was treating the Hispanic population here back in the 1800s. Does that make sense to everybody? I'm taking a look at this from the perspective of an inspector general looking at Texas, and I'm not an inspector general anymore, so I'm just an individual. I'm giving you a layman's point of view, but I'm going to go over material that's so important for you to understand why it is that our ancestors were violated in the way they were treated. Okay, if you notice, screen number 1 behind me, you'll see a Spanish ship. Believe it or not, your roots started on one of these ships at one time. They were delivered by Spain aboard one of these ships to populate this region. And they started way down in Central America and South America somewhere. I know the name of the place, but there's so much controversy over where they landed that I don't want to get into that, except to say and speculate that, yeah, they started there, and it took 300 years, from 1400 to 1700, to get to where? Where? How about the Rio Grande? Okay? And that's what we're all about. So, without further say, I'm going to show you some of the slides, some of the photos, some of the documents that I made available to the state back when I testified with them in 2014. Next slide, you're going to see bodies. And folks, let me say this about that. At one time, long time ago, you couldn't tell by looking at me now, but I used to fly helicopters. I was a pilot in Vietnam. So I understand a little bit about war, and I'm going to translate some of that to you with regard to what they did to our ancestors. But this pile of bodies and the next, look at slide 3 real quickie. Go to the next slide. That is a pile of bodies. Believe me, I've flown over areas where there were big battles, and this is a pretty large pile of bodies. And I've seen this in war. These are our people that were killed, slaughtered, massacred by Texas Rangers. And I'm going to try and connect some of these dots for you in just a minute. Notice on this slide, you see the thumbs of the individual in that picture? Can everybody see the thumbs? Can anybody not see them? Can you see that red dot? Can you see the red dot in the back? Okay. Let me tell you what that represents. Go to the next slide. These are the same thumbs. If you'll notice, I posted the documentary that it came from Border Bandits, and this was something that was mentioned by Dr. Gonzalez earlier. This is a postcard that was made of these bodies. This information was heralded all the way to the East Coast and up north. Anglos here would send these cards, make these postcards, send them up to their families and friends up north to advertise how far they had advanced in taking over Texas. We were like varmints. You'd think that they had receiving credit for killing a bunch of varmints, snakes. We were treated with very little regard for our lives. And I'm going to give you some specifics of that in just a minute. But the point that I want to make to you is this was the attitude, the prevailing attitude during that era of the life of Mexicanos. Okay, let's go to slide 5. For a proper assessment of cause of action that we need to take in this cause, to understand what rights were violated for our ancestors so that we can develop a process to move forward with and understand the very basics of what happened, why it is that our ancestors were violated. This man, Gary Paquet, PhD, Department of Economics, Central Michigan University, is an economist. Now, this is a very busy screen, so bear with me. What I'm going to do is go through it very slowly because it's got to sink in. I extracted some excerpts from this guy's work, and I want to go over those with you because watch what happens when we're finished with this. Just watch what happens to your mind and your heart and soul when we're finished with this. In the first item, he states, the founding fathers upheld the economic view of property. Founding fathers. He's talking about before the Constitution was even formed. I'm talking about the United States Constitution. He goes on to say they believed that private property ownership as defined under common law pre-existed government. You know, I've heard people like Yolanda, one of these folks here in the front row, speak of common law. And she alluded to the same thing I'm saying today. And once I grabbed this and looked at this, I understood where she was coming from. The state and federal governments were the mere contractual agents of the people, not the sovereign lords over them. All rights not specifically delegated to the government remain with the people. And I hear her saying, we're entitled to the minerals. That's a long way from this point of beginning, but we can connect the dots, including the common law provisions of private property. So the question that comes to mind is this. Since Texas seized lands from early Tejano families by using an administrative process implemented by the Borland and Miller Commission, an administrative agency appointed by the Texas legislature, did this act violate U.S. Constitution and or the doctrine intended by the Founding Fathers? We're going to collectively arrive at these conclusions in a minute, but you're beginning to get the gist. Did it violate the Constitution? No question in my mind. Now, second item, McQuay states, consequently, the constitutional rights regarding free speech, free religion, and the right to assemble and private property rights are all claims that individuals may hold and exercise against the government. What are you trying to do? Think about this. What are you trying to do? You're trying to tell Texas you violated our Constitution. So we need to connect some more dots here, and I'll get there in just a moment. Just bear with me. But The question that this brings is, under these constitutional provisions, how is it that Texas statutes of limitation can stymie efforts to recover lands taken illegally by Texas if such limitations were imposed after Texas became a state in 1845? You hear these cases being thrown out of court all the time because of statute of limitations. So, there are methods by which these things should be applied, in my opinion. Keep in mind, I'm a layman, I'm not an attorney. But I've seen enough of this, at least to understand that these are questions that can be posed, and perhaps in some way, some form, once we get together enough people and we become a viable force, and that shouldn't be long now, I'll speak some more about that in just a minute, I think that's going to be possible. And subject to provisions of the U.S. Constitution. So in effect, do the provisions of the Constitution supersede state statutes? Does everybody understand what I just said? Did anybody not understand what I just said? Do the provisions of the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, supersede state statutes that have been passed since the act of the Constitution? If so, if they don't, in effect, do the provisions of the Constitution supersede state statutes? And if so, will amends to the injustices committed against our ancestors require congressional action to remove those state statutes of limitation? My opinion, yes. We're going to need to find some congressional sources. And it's going to take time, and it's going to take money. A little bit from everybody, not a lot. And it isn't like it used to be, where people made false promises to you. With the alliance, hopefully, you'll understand. What you see is literally what you get. Okay. Let's go to item 3. Under the common law boundaries of private property, the common law has 3 pillars: private property, tort liability, and the law of contract. Property and tort liability are inexorably intertwined. No one has the right to infringe upon the legitimate rights of others. That's one of the weaker parts of it, but it's important for you to know. To me, it prompted 2 questions. In your opinion, did Texas, by seizing and removing early Tejano families from the lands, violate this part of the Constitution? No question. Second question, under these provisions of the U.S. Constitution, did early Tejano families have a legitimate right to the property they settled? They were here long before Texas even became a state. And what did we just hear from the Founding Fathers? That the right to own property preceded government. So how can this happen? Let's keep moving. Next slide. Item number 4, and I'm speaking to myself here. If I understand Piquet correctly, common law concerning property and government emerged from the Whigs in England. This is a party like Republicans and Democrats. This occurred in England years ago, and centuries ago. Accordingly, Piquet's research indicates that our forefathers deduced that the original owners of the land were the real sovereigns. You've heard that term used by the state, that it's got sovereign land. How many of you have heard that term? I've heard it till it's coming out my ears. Well, the original owners were the real sovereign, not the king. And he cites the old English saying, a man's house is his castle and every man is king. How many of us have heard that? Even though it's a small house, but yeah, we're the king in that house. Question. Does that implication hold true in how our Constitution interprets the original owners of the land? And does that recognize Tejano families as the original owners whose rights and protections were guaranteed or should have been guaranteed under the Constitution? I really believe that after 1845, yes, they were guaranteed these rights. Now we're going to get somewhere with this thing in just a minute, so bear with me. Item 5, concerning the intentions of our founding fathers and framers on property and government, Piquet indicates the way to examine the importance of private property to our forefathers and its place under the law is to study the words our founders and framers themselves used. Men like Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton. Jefferson argued that the colonial land holdings had always been held free and clear of British crown. In other words, when these folks came over from Europe and landed somewhere in the Northeast and began settling some land, they truly believed it belonged to them first and not to the king, not to the sovereign. They were the sovereign owners of it. And is it easy to connect that with what happened in Texas? Yes. Our people were here long before Texas existed. One more time. Okay, let's move on. Item 5. Concerning the intentions of our founders and framers on property and government, Piquet indicates that the way to examine, I'm sorry, I just repeated myself. This are the words that they used. Okay, question. If this philosophy was in fact the premise our forefathers had concerning constitutional property rights, and if the Howno families were subject to these interpretations, then would or could this item, combined with all the other discussed items in the questionnaire, have a basis for petitioning the state government for reparations of damages suffered by the Howno families who lost their entire holdings to illegal acts of the state? You know, based on the Constitution, the answer is yes. But there is so much intercession, information that intercedes in this. They're called, in some terms, they're called intervening variables. There are so many of them. State statutes, treaties that were agreed upon by Mexico and the United States, and then literally bastardized by the United States in the case of the Treaty of Guadalupe, because they eliminated, I think, Article 10 or Section 10 of it, which was the property rights. So we have to muddle through all of that, but first we have to have an understanding of why it is that the rights of our forefathers were violated according to our Constitution. So imagine this. In the Federalist Papers, James Madison and others argued that the proposed U.S. Constitution would protect the liberty and property of citizens from usurpations of power from the federal government. You know, the question pops up, well, if it applies to the federal government, shouldn't it apply to the state of Texas as well? You know, once again, there's all kinds of muddled things, intervening variables. But if subject to the U.S. Constitution after 1945, watch what happens with the next statement that McQuay makes. Alexander Hamilton contended that the new federal Constitution would protect private property and liberty from abuses at the state level. One more time, the Constitution is protecting us from abuses by the state. Does this reinforce what Madison said in the Federalist Papers? Yes, no question it does. So does this have impact? Is this a premise? Is this a stepping stone? Is this some fuel for what we're trying to find the state liable for? I think so. Once again, we have to get past all the variables, and you folks have got to hire an attorney. But this is information that's going to be available to you anytime you want it, anytime you need it, so that you can start creating in your mind how you move forward, how you look at this thing from that perspective. Because as you gather information, you need to make sure that you connect the state to it, and I'm going to get into that in just a little bit some more. Next item. McQuay states, fearful that the Constitution still concentrated too much power in the federal government, electorates in key states insisted upon a Bill of Rights lest they would reject the proposed Constitution. This is back when the Constitution was being formed, one more time, by our founding fathers. These are key states they're talking about. And so they insisted upon a Bill of Rights. These amendments soon became incorporated into the new Constitution. 6 of these 10 amendments pertain either directly or indirectly to private property. What does that say about the emphasis from our federal government and our federal Constitution about property rights? We're building a foundation that's extremely powerful here that was violated by the state. So we have to track this thing and find out how it is that they found themselves in a position where they could violate it and at least think that they could get away with it. It's been a century and a half. They throw the statute of limitations at us all the time. I've seen that. Many cases. There are stone walls of cases in Texas where people file cases against the state and they bounce off a stone wall. So is that a good precedent? I don't know. I have no idea. But we're studying this information, and it helps to know how we're going to get there. Let's move on to the next page, slide 7. The question that, the most notable from my interpretation is the Fourth Amendment, which concludes the clause, the rights of people to be secure in their persons, houses, and effects against unreasonable search and seizures. Unreasonable search and seizures. How about when they got burned out, killed, murdered? Is it reasonable to assume that the Fourth Amendment was violated and the Wait Tejano families were burned out of their homes and pushed off their lands at gunpoint? No doubt about that. A lot of stories. And this is why the documentary is being presented, being assembled by Ed Gonzalez. Is Ed here by chance? You saw Ed earlier photographing, moving around through the auditorium, photographing the proceedings. Those of you that wish to contribute your family's story to that documentary, by all means approach Ed, because he's going to try and get that on PBS funding, so it's going to be a documentary that's aired by thousands of people, maybe hundreds of thousands of people. So it's important for you to connect with him, and he's an extremely important part of our process. Okay, item 9, the question states the most explicit recognition of private property comes in the Fifth Amendment, which states, nor shall anyone be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. The big question looms in my head, was the Borland and Miller Commission due process of law, or was it an administrative process? I have no idea. An attorney would have to answer that question. And I'm willing to bet there's probably a whole bunch of intervening variables that he's going to run into, or he or she would run into, before they'd get a clean answer. But I can say this about that. If they took our land under the basis of an administrative action, and they demand, on the other hand, that the only way we can get retribution or reparation or amends is to go through the expensive court system and bleed our families dry of money to prove our case, is that a double standard? Is that two ends that balance? No. I think we deserve to have an administrative system, and this is what Benny Bach was talking about, and he introduced it to the Unclaimed Mineral Proceeds Commission, and they stated a suggestion in there for the state legislature to assign an interim charge of committee to study those injustices, because, as I mentioned earlier, 724 could not handle that kind of testimony. So, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. We know about the compensation. We never got paid. The first clause is called the due process clause, while the second part is referred to the takings clause. The takings clause requires all levels of government to justly compensate owners for property taken for public use. The taking clause was intended to prevent the government from forcing a few property owners from bearing the burdens of legislative measures intended to benefit the general public. They wanted to be able to tax that land, they wanted to be able to get it productive, and they wanted to be able to put in the hands of their favored people, people that had political strength and power and pull at that time. Did they require this of the entire state? No. You're going to find this activity most prevalent where? In South Texas during that era. Okay, question. Under these provisions, when Texas seized Tejano lands, did it violate the Fifth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution? Yes. Now, let's think for a moment collectively. Based on what we just heard, and assuming that we were back then, when it was supposed to be implemented, who in here does not believe that we had a good case against the state? All right? Now, show me your hands if you believe that this would be a foundation for petitioning the state for corrections. Raise your hands. Beautiful. Okay. I can tell you this, it takes one heck of a lot more than what I just covered for you. But you're right. The foundation is there. They violated all of these amendments, all of these laws. And we can prove they did. And they wash their hands of it with treaties that do not supersede the Constitution. The only way that the Constitution can be superseded if there's an act of Congress that changes the Constitution. But none of these provisions have ever been changed that I know of. Those of you that heard me testifying with the Unclaimed Mineral Proceeds Commission, there was a question about the funds that are coming out of the Unclaimed Mineral Proceeds Fund being dumped into the general fund. Now, many of you may not understand the terminology, but as a federal IG, I did nothing but investigate fraud, waste, and abuse in government. And the commingling of these funds is wrong. If there's a fund that's set up to be held in trust, like this Unclaimed Mineral Proceeds Fund, until the rightful owner is found, it cannot, by law, be commingled with the general fund and used for expenditures and programmed like a general fund is for the budget. No, it can't. It doesn't belong to the state. But the state's doing it. You know why? Because there hasn't been enough of us that have gotten together to assemble the force, the political force that it's going to take to get them to change. Now watch. We're doing these in different locations. I counted earlier about 150 people here, somewhere between 120 to 150. We've had 400 in other places, 180 one time in a storm in Corpus. And we're going to move on to other cities like San Antonio. But what Benny was saying, you've got to have the votes, and sooner or later, you've got to have the money. Can one person assemble the wherewithal to pay the money that it's going to take to get these acts changed in the legislature? No. And those that have that kind of money, they're not going to spend it in our cause. We're going to have to dig ourselves and determine if we want this well enough, hard enough, that we're willing to pay a few bucks a month to gather a fund so we can have the political strength to be able to change the laws. Now, watch. We're going to soon become the population majority. When I say we, I'm talking about Hispanics in Texas. So, when that happens, we need to be ready by then. We need to be prepared to launch this campaign. We need to refine this thing. I've been communicating behind the scenes with some legislators and some lobbyists one-on-one because as an Inspector General of the federal system, I would love to be able to participate in the parameters that are drafted so that families can have an adjudication system that's a claim system and not a court system. And it has to be fair. If they start throwing at us these intervening variables like the statute of limitations, when they violated the Constitution to begin with, it's never going to be fair. There has to be provisions made. I've seen cases kicked out because there were no witnesses. How in the dickens are we going to have somebody alive from 200 years ago? I wish. Believe me, at 70, I can tell you, 72, I can tell you it ends a lot quicker than 200 years. So what I'm hopeful of and what we're doing with this alliance is to form a nucleus of information, understanding, and management that has everything in it that it needs: the administration, logistics, coordination, communication, operations, all of it. Everything is necessary for an organization to survive and move forward as a machine that works for a cause. I've seen a lot of that. As an inspector general, I don't know how many of you people know what an inspector general is. An inspector general, in the minds of many people, is considered yet a real SOB, pardon my French. Because typically we appear at doorsteps and we start looking for fraud, waste, and abuse, but something has taken us there in the first place. So it was not a pleasant assignment that I had, believe it or not. It was assigned to me. I was assigned to it and had no choice. But what I'm trying to say to you is this: if we can assemble the wherewithal, and we have the majority of people in the state houses that can work for us. Right now we have a few. We have good ones in, but they're only a few. Once we gain a majority, if we're prepared by then and we have good young people that can sit up here and do what I'm doing and be able to muster some experience, or at least gather from other people, from older heads, older minds, pick up this information. How I wish 3 years ago when I was standing, or 2 or 3 years ago, I can't remember, when I was sitting at Holiday Inn and I had a guy like Nick Bailly, of the Bailly family, and Yolanda Martinez, that had done a tremendous amount of research in history. I was appalled by what I didn't know. I shared that today with Dr. Gonzalez. I've been Hispanic all my life. My mom was born in Monterrey. My father was a Quineno. Okay? So, from that background, let me tell you some of the experiences that I felt when I felt the sting of racism. Even in my age, I got a chance to see some of it. I don't know how many of you know or are familiar with Corpus Christi. One time it had only 2 high schools, Ray High School and Miller. Miller was on the wrong side of the tracks. It was on the other side of the tracks where Mexicanos lived. Ray was on the other side of the tracks where mostly whites lived. Somehow, my father managed to settle us on the Ray side of the tracks. And there were just a few of us that would go to school there. During pep rallies, when Ray was playing Miller, all the Anglos would convene in one side of the gym and all the Mexicanos in the little corner because there were a few of us. And you'd hear the old chants from the Anglos, hey, hey, ho, ho, send them back to Mexico. and they'd look at us. They were looking at us when they did this, okay? Had I known then what I know now, I would have recognized they're the guys that invaded us. Hell, we were here long before they got here. But I didn't know that. So what Dr. Gonzalez and his other 4 colleagues are doing is tremendous. Gosh, it's overdue. And we've got to find the force. We've got to be able to assemble the young people that can carry this flag further and make sure that there's an organization that stands for the rights of Mexicanos to advance the cause in so many different ways, not just land grant people. I'm going to show you in just a few minutes why it has to be more than just land grant people. You've seen the murders, okay? The next guy I talk about, let's move on to slide number 8. James Ferguson was the governor of Texas, 1915-1917. This guy, according to author John William Webber, he hired a guy named Ransom, who was a felon, a known felon. According to stories, and I don't have this thing carved in stone, but according to stories, Ransom did time in the prison because he was in a courthouse where an attorney was rendering testimony that he didn't agree with, and he took his pistol out and shot the attorney in the courthouse. This is a guy that supposedly Ferguson hired. He did. This is a fact now. Now I'm going to fact. A while ago I was speculating. Now I'm going to fact. I was quoting a John William Webber a while ago. Now I'm telling you I'm quoting the archives. This guy Ferguson assigned Henry Ransom, gave him the rank of captain in Texas Rangers, gave him a contingency Texas Rangers, and sent him down to the valley to clean up the problem that he, Ferguson, and the state was having with Hispanics in the valley. Those piles of bodies that you saw, I was relating to very early history when I talked about the Constitution. And the inference was, I want you to see the outcome of what happens when the Constitution is violated. But they came from this time frame. It was James Ferguson, this guy Ferguson, during this era, when those piles of bodies occurred. And that's what Dr. Gonzalez was talking about with the Porvenir massacre. They lined up people aged, I think, 6, 7 to 70-something, marched them up against the rock wall and massacred them because the Bright Ranch store had been raided during Christmas. And they felt that it had come out of Porvenir. The people of Porvenir, Texas, had done that. The village doesn't exist anymore. I can understand why. But that's the kind of treatment that we got. That's the kind of horrendous, unconstitutional treatment of our people. So this guy, Ferguson, hired this guy, Henry Ransom, to go down and do these things. Now watch. In the Texas House of Representatives prepared 21 charges against Ferguson. He was indicted. Well, first of all, he ordered something to happen, an application to the University of Texas, and he wanted to veto this. There was a retaliation against a veto that he had because someone had said something that he didn't agree with. Like, for example, today, if Dr. Gonzalez had did something that the governor hadn't agreed with, that was the standing. That was what happened back then. Someone in the university system said something. And keep in mind, Dr. Gonzalez mentioned that there were Anglos that didn't like what was happening. And it's obvious, and you're going to see in just a minute when I get there, on some of the cases that were heard in the state legislature, that there were Anglos that didn't like the fact that we were being treated that way. But this guy had 21 charges against him, and the Senate convicted him on 10, including misapplication of public funds and receiving $156,000 from an unnamed source. The Texas Senate removed Ferguson as governor and declared him ineligible to hold office under the Texas jurisdiction, despite his rulings. Now, I want to take just a minute and focus one more time back and forth, but I want to connect the dots for you. Watch. If a Texas Ranger pulled the trigger on somebody and killed them, he's an officer of the state. But that individual could be tried for murder if he didn't use the right discretion or the law. If a Texas Ranger killed a Mexicano, back then, and he didn't do it lawfully, meaning in self-defense or trying to stop some belligerent crime, if he just arbitrarily shot and killed a Mexicano, he could be tried for murder. My brother dug up the same 3 volumes of the Texas Ranger examination, Texas Ranger investigation of 1919, that you see at the museum that had been posted by these 5 scholars, Never to Forget Project. I didn't know until they discovered this or posted it that these volumes had been sealed for 50 years. I'm drawing an inference from this, but why would they seal him for 50 years? Why not 25? Why not 100? Because in the government at that time, I'm sure it was known that there was a difference between individual acts of savagery and institutional acts of savagery. And that's what I want to pause and focus on right now. Yes, after 50 years, most of those Texas Rangers that pulled the trigger would probably be dead and gone. But now, if Ferguson ordered this, and it came from his directives, is this an individual act of savagery, or is the state responsible for this and accountable for it? Remember, this guy is the governor. When he directs and when he speaks and when he orders for the state, not for himself. He represents the state government. Is this an institutional crime? Is this an individual act of savagery or institutional act of savagery? I mentioned that to the Unclaimed Mineral Proceeds Commission. Lance Brune, who's the chairman, is an attorney. He asked me back and to refer to that finding. That was one of the findings that I gave him. And it showed up in the final report. And the point that I'm making here is the state can no longer say they don't understand about what we're looking at and how we're looking at it. But if the state ordered these murders and they can be connected to this guy's directive, bet your bottom dollar that the state's responsible. And the list that Dr. Gonzalez gave us today, which I understand is going to allow us to post it on our website. If it connects any of those, I'd sure like to know about it. Remember that. Those of you that haven't seen our website, please by all means go to it. And I'm going to put it up on the screen in just a minute when it's over so that you can copy it down. It's www.rootsoftexas.com/. You are the roots of Texas. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. I'm sure all of you, if not most of you, have seen this picture before. Who has not? Okay, this is the first time you saw the picture. These are Texas Rangers with a rope around Hispanic bodies that they've been dragging around behind these horses. You know, it makes you wonder if these people were killed before they were dragged or they were dragged to death. I have no idea. You can only imagine the cruelty, the horrific, the horrible imagery from this. I firmly believe the guy in the middle is Henry Ransom. Okay? From my research, he's the guy. So, this is after Ferguson ordered him down there to go clean up the mess. There's a testimony that Ferguson offered to an investigator that was looking at some of these crimes. And if what information I have is correct, and it's not, again, carved in stone, I've read it somewhere, I've seen it published in a bunch of places, that doesn't mean it's carved in stone. That does mean it's accurate and can be proven accurate. But according to that testimony, when Ferguson was asked about this issue, his answer was, I am the governor. I ordered him to clean it up, and if it took him killing every Mexican down there, I will pardon him for it. Anybody else heard that before? That was his answer. Okay? So, when you look at this, this is not an individual act of savagery if it was an outcome of Ferguson's directive. Am I making sense there? Let's go on. Slide 10. Galen Greaser is the author of a new guide to Spanish Mexican land grants in South Texas, the official guide of the Texas General Land Office in Austin, Texas, 2009. Galen Greaser is considered the resident expert of Texas in matters of land grants, Mexican and Spanish land grants. He is the Bible. He wrote the Bible that Texas uses, okay? Gosh, I was supposed to bring that book with me so I could show it to you, but most of you probably know which one it is. In any event, I did an extract because I want to show you an excerpt from his information here, and it comes out of page 131, 132 of that book, okay, the new guide to Spanish and Mexican land grants in Texas. Look down at the bottom of this. Can everybody see the bold print where it says examples of fraud, forced evictions, and illegal seizures of land can unfortunately be found? Can you see that? Here, the father of all information regarding Texas land grants, Spanish Mexican land grants, is saying, admitting that some of these things occurred. So, how can the state refuse to hear these? How can the state stonewall all these cases? And let me talk a little bit about Rule 91A. The last hearing that I went to had to do with the Galan case. It was in Austin. Rule 91A is a rule that any judge can use to just dismiss a case. And when you read the parameters of 91A, it just turns your stomach. They can throw the thing out for little nothing. Okay? So that's what they used to dismiss that case, Rule 91A. Didn't say they didn't have enough evidence. They didn't say it wasn't good evidence. They didn't say it was a good case. Nothing like that. They used Rule 91A. Send them out. Send them packing. So there's some issues with the state, and sooner or later, I think they're going to pay the price, and you'll see in just a minute. Okay, let's go to slide number 11. The Texas General Assembly of 1845, the debate over Tejano land seizures. It started with Governor Peter Bell. He was getting pressured by people in the border, some Anglos in the border that wanted to get in on the cash cow, cash in or cash out or gain land that was being taken out. And you saw some excerpts that Dr. Gonzalez put together this morning concerning the very same guy I'm talking about, Henry Ransom, saying he cleaned out some people from certain ranches. Everybody remember that? Here we are. He was getting pressured, so he asked the state legislature to do something about it, to settle these question of titles, to settle the question of titles. Remember, that was settled years before, because our folks had been here since the 1700s, since before the state of Texas was a state. But they needed to have some way of taking this property away. And if you look down there, the intent of the article was to punish Texans of Mexican descent who had sided with General Santa Anna or who remained neutral. They were going to take land away from them if they had failed to take up arms and aided the state. Now, let me talk about that a little bit. And this is something that I would hope maybe our PhD and educator researchers might be able to find. Was this applied to Anglos like it was Mexicanos? In other words, if they took land from somebody because he had failed to pick up arms and go join the fray against Mexico, not that he had helped Santa Anna, I can understand that one. He would be considered a spy. today in the United States if he helped the enemy, but simply just didn't pick up an arm and go fight. There was no provisions over age, sex, nothing. If simply the individual didn't pick up arms and go fight, the land was confiscated. Now, today I'm 72 years old. When I was 23, I was in war and I was in battle. I flew over 500 combat missions as a combat assault pilot. Today, I couldn't do that. If I prayed all day on my knees that God give me the wherewithal to do that, there's no way. And what I told the commission when I read this, and I put this in front of the commission, I said, can any one of you tell me that you would pick up your gun and go join the fray? I couldn't get an answer from them. Of course, it was a facetious question. So they weren't going to answer it. But nonetheless, what I'm saying here is, look at the cruelty that they used by which to seize land and the ridiculous discrimination that they used to seize land. So again, connecting all the dots we did earlier with the Constitution, this happened in 1845. Guess what? On page 135 of Galen Greaser's book, you can see that it happened again in 1879. That was 5 years after Texas became a state, and they were still discriminating. They were still seizing lands illegally. So, it doesn't end in preparing this information. And this information is available to you anytime you want it. I'd be glad to help you if it helps your cause. Let's go to the next slide. No. Okay. Paul S. Taylor was an economist from California. He lived from 1895 to 1984, so he lived a very long life. But he did a study that was actually done with a grant and aid from the University of California in Berkeley. And it had to do with Nueces County from early August through September, spanning the cotton harvest in 1929. And here's some of the things that Paul offered. Let's go to number 13. If you look at the yellow highlights, and it's kind of blurry, so bear with me, but I'll read it to you. Paul was actually asking people, administrators of the school, these questions. And one of the questions he asked about compulsory attendance from Hispanic children, because they separated the school, they separated Mexicanos from the Anglos. This is what this particular administrator answered. The board won't let me enforce compulsory attendance. When I come to a new school, I always ask the board if they want the Mexicans in school. Here they told me to leave them alone. If I tried to enforce the compulsory attendance law here, the board would get sore at me and maybe cause us to lose our places. So I don't say anything. If I get 150 Mexicans ready for school, I would be out of a job. And the trustees say we have too many Mexicans in school now. Don't build up any more Mexican enrollment. We have more than we can handle now. We would have to build a new building in schools and hire 3 or 4 more teachers. So leave it alone. Let's go to 14. More on education for Paul, he asked the question, what is the attitude toward the education of the Mexicans? The answer, the attitude toward the Mexicans is to be sure to get them on the school census. Gathering them up once a year, because The state will pay $17.50 per head, per capita, of state aid for the Mexicans in this district. And they draw about $6,000 of state aid, and we spend on them about $2,000. They were very diligent about gathering our children up for the head count, but then they would send the money to the Anglo schools. This is good documentation, folks. This is a PhD, and these field notes I'm hoping I can get someday so we can have all the backup that we need. And he said this is true everywhere in Texas. We also have an $18,000 property tax that all goes on the white schools. Most of the schools here take money out of the Mexican allotment and use it for the whites. In this same connection, a well-informed American carefully estimated that of the districts outside of Corpus Christi with which he was familiar, this included nearly all in the county. 21 spent less in 1928-29 on education of Mexicans than received from the state on the basis of their numbers on that census. Let's go on to slide 15. Now, this one really stuck a dagger in the heart, okay? This guy goes on to say, we couldn't run the Mexican school 7 months a year on the Mexican taxes. In other words, first, they took the land away from us. So we didn't have a tax base. And then they punished our children because we didn't have a tax base. Can anybody see that? Can anybody understand the cruelty? What does it do to you? That's why I have to be so careful to qualify this information and tell you it's important for us to know the history. It's important for our future generations to know the history so that it's never repeated. But it's so important that we understand that God doesn't want us to try and get retribution for this. We just want justice. That's all. We don't want to harm anybody. I'm going to tell you in a little bit how we can do that with the state without harming anyone. Down at the bottom, he goes on to say, we start the Mexican school 1 month after the whites, but not over 5 would come if we opened it sooner. We stopped the Mexican school term 1 month early for cotton chopping. How about that? What does that do to your heart when you hear that? You know what it does to me? It gives me a lot of thanks to God that I didn't live in that era, because I probably wouldn't have lived long. And I'll leave the rest of that to your imagination. Paul Taylor on justice. Senator Dreyer was an individual that was actually asked to comment on some personal outrages of how Mexicans were treated in Texas in the 70s, during the 1870s. Undoubtedly, robberies and murders by Mexicans from Mexico have almost continually been perpetrated in Texas, but in retaliation, Americans have committed terrible outrages upon citizens of Mexican origin. In passing through B County, we heard of a Mexican, a quiet citizen, so reported to be by the presiding justice of the county, an American, who had been brutally murdered a few days before our arrival by several Americans because, as was stated to General Steele, the Mexican would not go play the fiddle for them. Now, just using your imagination, you know, the first thing that comes to mind is, okay, these supposedly Americans were having some kind of a party. They were drinking. And they wanted this man to come play the fiddle for them, and he wouldn't do it. So what did they do to him? They killed him. And he goes on to say, this substantiates fully General Steele's report that there is a considerable element in the country bordering on the Nueces and West that think the killing of a Mexican is no crime. Okay, let me go back to the first screen. Can you take me back, please? Here you see at the very bottom our website.
First picture?
It's the very first one. There. At the very bottom is our website address. It's www.rootsoftexas, all in one word, .com with a /. I would recommend that you follow this. It's been growing a little bit at a time. And keep in mind, we've only existed for less than a year. So it's not fully populated yet, but it's getting there. And there's a tremendous amount of information we've been putting on there that's extremely valuable to you. Among those are those Texas Ranger investigations that happened in 1919. Now, at this point, how much time do I have left? I can handle a couple of questions if you folks have any questions. Does anyone here have a question that they would like to ask about this material that I discovered? No? Yes, ma'am. Go ahead. Yeah. Thank you, sir. Go ahead.
My statement is, of all the meetings that I have attended, this is by far the best because of education that you have given us.
Thank you.
In reference to that Spanish ship there, it's called a fragata.
It's called what?
It's called a fragata. It's called, in English, it's galleon.
Galleon, that's right.
Our forefathers, first of all, my name is Reynaldo Bailly, Jr.
Yes, sir.
Our forefathers disembarked from Cadiz, Spain in 1569 in la fragata San Francisco, okay? And that's of record. They arrived in the Nueva España, and from there he proceeded to be the fourth printer of the first printing press in the New World, okay? So education-wise, Mr. Falcon, I appreciate
Thank you so
the
much.
knowledge that you have given us, because it's only the tip of the iceberg. We have other information that has never been brought out because basically I myself, as one of the 6 representatives of the family, wouldn't allow any gringos to attend any of our meetings because we're giving information that's true. It's the truth that has never been given in Texas history books.
Yes.
And I used to argue with the history teachers, and I used to go to the main office all the time. But I knew that my forefathers weren't lying to me because she would always put the Texas Rangers up here. And I would say, no, you're in the wrong place, in the wrong boat.
Yes.
And I thank God that I can continue giving this information to our children. And that's what we've got to do.
Yes.
And like you say, we have to unite.
Yes.
And uniting, we've become a large force. And we become strength in getting all the Texas senators, Texas Congress representatives that don't agree to agree the truth and do something about it to get them out and put young people
Yes.
like our ancestors did, you know. They taught us to lead, not to follow. And we're all here leaders. And we gotta lead by organizing, like you say, getting you together and educating them. And of course, not allowing any gringos to come into the office here so they can use that information against us later on in fraudulent documents like we do have or run across in the research that we've done. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Well, I understand the constitutional, amendments and what they guarantee, which they didn't guarantee to us, but that's the proof we need to, produce. But in reading Galen Geeser's land grants book, the one you mentioned in I know 2009, that latest publication, it said that in 1836, if you own the land, you own the mineral rights. But thereafter, there's a question, and that's written in his own book, the Bible of land grants.
Right.
So what is the problem? Besides, we can prove the injustices by not honoring our constitutional rights and our property rights.
Yes.
But then they come in with the Treaty of Guadalupe and this and that, and
Right.
we wind up with, maybe we don't own the mineral rights.
Yes.
So I don't know what to believe.
Well, let me make this comment, and this is my opinion. I'm not an attorney, so it's not even a legal opinion. But my opinion is, just from looking and studying the course of claims, the course of cases that have been filed against state in the Texas courts, Texas has done a travesty of justice with those cases because they stonewall them. There may be one or two that were paid, but most of those, at least one of those, the bigger ones that I've seen, was an individual against an individual, not an individual against the state. The state has never claimed responsibility for this. So what you're saying is that they're not recognizing that you're the owner of the land. This is why it's so important to do what we're doing, because the first step is, and I'm hoping we can get this done, to get one of the three, any one of these could do it, the governor, speaker of the House, or the lieutenant governor. They could appoint a committee, interim charge, to hear these complaints. And now it's information that they can take in and digest. They can't say, we can't do anything with this because it doesn't fit the parameters of House Bill 724, okay? But if we can get this committee appointed, and it was suggested to the state, we get this committee appointed and have hearings, very similar to the ones we had with House Bill 724, and start gathering that information. Now we have something very useful that you could use. Following that, when we prove to them that there's a just reason to have an adjudication system that doesn't require people to dig into their life savings to be able to pay an attorney to take this case to court, and it's done through an adjudication system like a claim system, then it's fair and balanced, and that would be the next step to get it approved by the House and the Senate. It's going to take what Benny Bach was talking about earlier today. The reason we're providing this information to you is so that you can see one thing: the value that it brings to you. That's the impression I hope that I can impart in your minds, that if what we have here is valuable to you, then we need to exploit it. We need to continue developing it. You saw that we gather people like Ashley, a young teacher. We need more of that. Once we get that adjudication system in place, that's just a small step in advancing the cause of Mexicanos. We can never allow to happen what happened in the past, and now it's gone into the institution. They're not doing it overtly. They're not calling us racial. You don't hear racial slurs very frequently. But you see the institution stonewalling us for justice. We have to break that barrier, and the only way to do it is to unite, to organize, and to build a pool. And the problem we've had in the past is when somebody sits up here like I'm sitting up here and telling you, okay, let's contribute money to this and let's build a pool, the pool disappears and there's no accountability for it. So people get sick and tired of that. That's what we're up against. And this is why I created an executive committee of 10 people to oversee what I do. And up front, you were given a list of these 10 people, okay? Because you can feed your information in through them or with them. And the last thing we're going to do today, we've got to hear from one other speaker, but the last thing we're going to do today, put up slide number 18. Which one? Number 18, the last one with the Texas map. The last thing we're going to do today, and we're starting this here. Remember I said earlier we're going to start this organization here in South Texas? This is a map of South Texas. And what we're going to try and do is organize points of contact, people in these southern counties, and move up the state as far as we can, as fast as we can, with people that can volunteer to do some of the legwork that it takes to get information disseminated and people organized so we can get what? The vote out. It doesn't matter if it's Republican or Democrat or whatever. What matters is that these folks understand that we need someone that can be balanced and just with our cause. And it's focused strictly on land grants. But let me tell you, when you stop and think about what they did to the Mexican schools, was that affecting only land grant heirs, descendants? No. It applied to everybody. The man that got killed in B County because he wouldn't go play the fiddle, was he a land grant descendant? Who knows? It didn't matter to them. So what we're doing applies to every Hispanic all over this country. And we're only starting in Texas, and we're going to start in South Texas for organizing. Okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead, ma'am. You've got the floor.
I guess what you did right now, you answered, explained something, preluded to what I thought when I was sitting in my chair. One thing that arises in my mind is the fact that it's called an alliance, or let's get together and let's see what we can brainstorm and do this. You know what? It sounds good, and I can run with an idea, but to be more specific, it has to be more connected. And to be more connected, you have to be, and you use the word I'm just going to use right now, accountability. You talk about 10 people within your circle, probably, that you know, that you're familiar with, and so on and so forth, that they're going to oversee you. That means that you're going to be the center and the core of whatever you project or you want to form. That's the problem with what we are faced as a community, as Tejanos. Tejanos is what we are. But you know what? And there's a lot of pride in that. But then there's a lot of suffering too. Weigh out the balances. But what I'm alluding to is something that perturbs me in the sense that we have been down this road many times before with different faces, with different legal minds, with different advocators, with different agitators, with different. You know what? It sounds like it's another idea with another road. But yet we as the public, we need to know, is the direction that you want to take or somebody else wants to take, is that the correct way to go? Or are we just building more and more and getting fatter and fatter on information and building and getting nowhere? Because time is of the essence, and not everybody's 22. We're not 22 anymore. And
Yeah.
This is something that really disturbs me, because we need to find out where we're going, what it's going to take, and accountability. Okay, then we didn't, like you just said, a judge can rule whatever, 91.8 or whatever you said, and
91A.
then throw you out of court.
Yeah.
He doesn't have to tell you anything.
Sure.
So we're going to build up all of this, and we're going to start giving money to it, and then the judge says, you know what?
And it falls down and does nothing.
Does.
Okay, those are all good points that you just brought up, but let me give you a decisive difference between what's happening today and what happened in the past. Statistically, the state was not poised to gain a population majority of Hispanics like it is now. So what you're saying is, you're asking what we're doing, and I iterated over and over again. We're preparing for the time that we do have the majority, so that several things can happen. One, we can push hard, and I've been very specific about that. We push hard to get this committee, interim charge committee appointed, legislative committee, so they can hear the injustices that happen and document them. That's different from what's happened in the past. And second, We've never had someone, a legislator with the experience of Benny Bach, that was on a commission that recommended a solution. He recommended what we've been looking for a long time, for the state to create some kind of an adjudication system that will hear the claims of the individual families without having to pay all this cost, this legal cost. So that's decisively different from what's happened in the past that I know of. And here's the final point. I'm giving you the benefit of my experience, and I'm not a God. I can't tell you that everything I think about is correct, that I cover all the bases and all the aces. But guess what? That's why we created a democratic process and we assigned, you voted. This happened in Corpus. It was voted on the floor by over 400 people to elect the people that you see as the list of people, the staff, to oversee what I do. This way, it's not a dictatorship, and if you ever have some kind of recovery from the state, we're not going to touch it. It's yours. So it's very different from what happened in the past. I was here in this part of the country when the reclamación program, remember that? And we were asked for money, okay? That happened. A lot of people paid money, and where is it? What happened? Nothing that I know of. They took the money. We're going to make sure we don't touch your money if you ever get any recovery from the state. We're only going to try and pave the way for you to be able to have a recovery or to petition for it without it breaking the family bank. That's what we're trying to do. So we're very specific about that.
My second just kind of suggestion or maybe thought, if you will, instead of just having you and 10 people that you know or are comfortable with,
Sure.
And call it an alliance or an allegiance or whatever, why not form a corporation and have us all be there when you hold your meetings and are able to see the do's and the don'ts and the whys and the what fors?
Let me suggest something to you. We don't shut the door to anyone that wants to come either speak to the alliance, to the executive committee. We can put you on the agenda and you can come do that. Or you can volunteer to get nominated to be a part of the executive committee and do some of this work. Because as the juices are flowing in your mind, you're saying things that are extremely useful. But thinking them is one thing. Implementing them is a different matter.
I just want everybody to be informed. The thing is, if you're going to start something, make it accessible and accountable to everybody. So we're all hearing the same thing in Corpus Christi, like we hear in Austin,
Yes.
like we hear in Brownsville,
Yes.
and Louisiana.
And that's a good point. See here,
that's something.
what we're doing is we're posting these on our website. So yes, it's accessible to you. That website has them all, except maybe the very first, I can't remember. But we have all of that information in there, and I think the first one that we had, I did an after-action report on and posted it on the web. The second one, I think we had some kind of videos because we had people like the land commissioner, Jerry Patterson, and we had a wonderful presentation from Dr. Luna from Indiana University School of Law. So I wish I could tell you that all the information that's shared in every meeting is shared in every meeting, but it's not. The agenda changes, so it's incumbent upon those of you who can attend all the meetings to do so, and if you can't, that's okay. The only thing that you have that would keep you informed would be, the most important component would be our website, and you do have access to that.
Thank you very much, sir.
You're
Have a good
welcome.
afternoon.
Thank you, ma'am.
Okay, I'm back.
Yes, ma'am.
Because
Sure, go
I
ahead.
want to make a comment to the lady that just was up here just now.
Okay.
The path we're taking is totally different from others. And I'll tell you why. Because there have been lawyers that have asked families for money, and they pursue the unclaimed money for unknown heirs. And so they're going after money. That particular group is going after money, these lawsuits, that's in the state coffers of the Treasury, because they didn't know who to pay. Okay, that's one path. Okay, the other path is in banks, because before 1985, when the money was sent to Austin, it was put in banks for about 50 years. So there may be money in banks. That's another route. But I like this path, because what he's doing, he's looking at the Constitution, and nobody should go against the Constitution, not even the states. And so I say this, I do appreciate your work, and I can see its value, because it is that they have not honored the Constitution. And that's another path to get the money. If you can't go to the state, if you can't go and sue them and get the money that's there in the general fund that they didn't label for us, the unknown heirs, if you don't have a bank where my ancestors actually had some bank deposit money before 1985, when Ms. Richards became the treasurer and said, oil companies have to send it to us. For those unknown heirs, we have to keep that money for every 3 years. The oil companies will give that money to us. Well, that's the money that some of these lawsuits are going after. And then there's the banks. That's another route. But this route I like, because everybody, if you're a citizen, you're entitled to your constitutional rights. And what he's been talking about is they did not honor it, they broke the law, and the federal government supersedes the state. And that's for the lady who wondered if we're another group that's going to hold money and do whatever with it. Right. Exactly.
Well, thank you so much. And you know, one thing I want to emphasize about that, every family has to prepare its case. We're not doing that for you.
No.
We're trying to provide information that helps you. Provide the sources, provide the references, provide the people, provide the connections. But we don't plan to get involved in that, because we don't want to collect, we don't want to touch your money. Your families have got to be able to do that on their own. We're going to help you all we can. What we can do is assemble the political force to make sure they hear you fairly. That's our objective.
The other last thing I wanted to point out, for anybody who went to those commission meetings all year in 2014, or if you saw it on the computer, what did that Bruin, was his name, the leader of the commission, he kept asking us, how much money do you want? And how will we divide it? He kept asking us that for months. But what did he say in December, the last meeting? He said, you're gonna have to document your individual injustices, right, and you can come here, and if you can prove it, we'll give you the money. That's what he said.
Thank you, ma'am. Yes, sir. I'm going to take this last question, and we're going to take a little break, because we got to hear from other people yet this afternoon yet. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Falcon, for your efforts. I just wanted to ask you if you are familiar with the stolen documents of Camargo.
I'm sorry?
If you're familiar with the stolen documents of Camargo.
No, sir, I'm not.
Okay, well, the documents were stolen from, I believe, a Catholic church in Camargo many years before I was born.
Yes, sir.
I was born in 1952. I'm 63 years old now. And I didn't find out about this history till, I would say, about 12 years ago. Mm-hmm. And I feel like the education system has failed me, or either lied to me. Because when I was in my history class, I was learning about the forefathers in the 13 colonies, mm-hmm, when I should have been learning about our forefathers here in Camargo, Reynosa.
Right.
But nevertheless, the stolen documents of Camargo were somehow got to the hands of a Mr. Fry in Mission and a Mr. Eckert. And the Texas Rangers sent an investigator to get these documents from these two people and take them up to the state.
Excuse me, when did it happen, más o menos?
Pardon me?
When did that happen, more or less?
I want to say it happened in 1978.
Okay, wow.
Yeah,
Just
when they
recently.
sent, yeah, recently, when they sent a Texas Ranger
Yeah.
to confront these gentlemen that had documents from Hispanic landowners, and they were, you know, wheeling and dealing with these documents.
Yes, sir.
My understanding is that these documents got to Austin, and by the Texas Ranger. And in 1979, I think the governor, I don't recall who he was back in '79. Any historians here? The governor in '79 called the governor of the state of Tamaulipas, which was Cárdenas, and offered some of these documents so that he could take back to Mexico with him. But some of those documents, or copies of those documents, stayed here in Texas. And I was wondering if you were familiar with that particular case.
I am not, but I would certainly would. And let me refer you, is Ed Gonzalez here by chance? Good. Ed in the back. You see that gentleman in the back that's waving his hand?
Yes, sir.
I would strongly advise you to visit with him
Okay.
because he's putting together a documentary of our story.
All right. Well, I
That
figured
could.
I have copies of that particular case.
And see,
And-
one of the things that has to happen before the documentary becomes effective, there has to be some full proof evidence
Okay. Yeah.
that it did occur.
Sure.
He would be the gentleman to run that by, but I would
Alright.
strongly recommend that you do
Very
that. And
well.
yes, I would like to know that story myself. I can tell you this from my experience. I saw where in that Bible that Galen wrote about land grants, a number of applications went down with a steamship in the off the coast of the Gulf, off the Gulf Coast. I mean, has anybody heard of that? You wonder whose applications went down there and why. And you know, I hear people like Yolanda, for example, indicate, yeah, they always use a premise that the title is not there for the land. And considering all the corruption that occurred back then,
Yes, sir.
all the murder, yeah,
So you
I
think
can
that
see
this
that.
would be something that you all could use in
yes,
your,
sir, by all
in your
means,
study?
see Mr. Ed Gonzalez, and
Very well.
thank you so much.
Yeah,
for your
thank you,
contribution.
sir, very much. I
Yes, sir,
appreciate it.
you're welcome.